Well, running a school district has never been easy, but it's a lot harder these days in the era of a COVID-19 pandemic with concern for the different needs of so many students. And I'm here today to talk with Framingham Superintendent Dr. Robert Tremblay about what's happening in Framingham with reopening, with ongoing education, with keeping people safe, and all of the associated issues that come into play. Thank you for being with me today, Dr. Tremblay.
Thanks so much for having me. It's nice to be back on your show again.
Well, it's great to have you here. We have so much to talk about, and I want to start way back when it all began in March with the first school closing at the beginning of COVID-19. It was pretty sudden. One day students and teachers and staff were in class, and then the next day they weren't, and they didn't go back. So how do you assess how much learning has actually taken place since back then?
Yeah, it seems like it was just yesterday. I think this is one of those situations where you can remember where you were and what time it was and how you were feeling when the world changed. And that's how it was for us that day in March when we had notification. In fact, we had what we thought was a planning meeting for what we knew was coming. And then suddenly Dr. Wong, Director of Public Health, pulled me aside and said, we have a situation where we had some, we have a presumptive positive case at Potter Road. And that changed everything because those students were on their way to school. This notification came early in the morning, maybe 9 o'clock in the morning. And we had to just roll the buses back. And then we realized that, we transport our students from Potter and also Hemingway. So we didn't know if there was going to be some exposure at both schools. So suddenly, in the matter of, as you mentioned, the matter of minutes, 2 schools were closed out of our 15. And so that changed everything for us. And then we had to pivot and be fully remote. And so to answer your question, the shift to going from full in-person to full remote was a challenging one. And I think it will continue to prove to be a challenging one if we're not back in person. I think that it's raising to the fore, the inequities that exists in not just our community, but in communities everywhere. It's disproportionately marginalizing students from accessing education, and frankly, it's just really not a best practice. Education systems are designed to be collaborative and in-person experiences.
Exactly. So how many students actually participated in remote learning at what you would call a satisfactory level once school closed for the rest of the year?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing generally, and Framingham is probably not dissimilar, we're seeing probably less than 50% engagement. And even communities that established, I won't name them, but even the communities that have established, one-to-one systems, which we were working toward doing, even those school districts that had established one-to-one programming were seeing engagement as being very low because there's really no expectation. You really can't hold grading. It's really difficult to hold people accountable. So unless a student or their family knowingly and willingly engages in learning, what's the carrot you sort of dangle to get people to do that? So we saw less than 50%. What we did in our specific districts, we created a tracking mechanism that ranged from 0 to 3. And so what we did was we asked teachers to track the level of engagement that they have with their class. Let's say an elementary classroom teacher meets with her class or his class daily or weekly, whatever they did. And that's a separate conversation around some contractual obligations there. Mm-hmm. But what we would track is, a 3 was all the time fully engaged, to a 0 was, we didn't see that child.
Right. So are you concerned that some kids are getting left behind, and what do you do to make up for that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very concerned. I was concerned about that from day one, particularly students on IEPs or students who require language support that happens in person. How does that happen in a remote environment? And frankly, I don't think it does. And if it does, it doesn't happen well. So what we've been trying to do, but again, we're kind of stuck. Schools are closed, and how do you address that? So That's what we're trying to do. Is we think though that by tracking the level of engagement, we're able to now know where exactly we'll have to remediate when school reopens in the fall.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, will you provide more one-on-one instruction to those students who appeared to have lost some of their education? Will they have to pick up where they left off, or did everyone move ahead and just moves forward from that point? I mean, how do you make up for those discrepancies?
So we were able to track those standards. So just generally speaking, the state had identified what they called these sort of requisite standards, prerequisite standards that we had to focus on. So it wasn't the whole, because you look at the time span from say mid-March to the end of the school year, you're looking at a fraction of the school year, but important nonetheless. So the state identified which of the sort of power standards need to be explored. We were able to track that because the expectation was what happened in the virtual world is it allowed us to coordinate vertically and horizontally, which is actually much easier to do in a remote environment than it is in person. And so we're able to actually pinpoint where every teacher left off with their curriculum and which students engaged in it, how they did, and where they have to be remediated. So the first order of business when we come back to school is to make sure that we pick up individual students where they left off. And so it's going to become, for the first time, and this has always been a vision of mine actually, is how can we find a way to customize learning for every child relative to where they are along the learning spectrum. Students with IEP services in particular, that's going to be a different kind of challenge where we'll have to, with schools being closed, there was only so much we could do virtually. And so we're going to have to really try to pick up from where we left off and provide as much service as we can to jumpstart the school year. And we'll try to do that late summer to get a head start.
Okay, so are you going to have summer learning for certain students, but not all of them? How's that going to work?
Yeah, so right now it's a remote environment because we don't, the rules of engagement keep changing, and understandably because it's being driven by the medical field. And as new medical information becomes available, once upon a time we believed students to be the primary carriers of COVID-19. Come to find out, they're not. In fact, the contact tracing revealed that students or young children play a very little role, if any, in carrying the virus. And so that's changing some of the game of our thinking. But I think there's an opportunity for sort of a soft rollout come summertime for us when we have the guidelines in place, and that's been made clear by the department. We can begin to bring back some of our more vulnerable populations, students who I would say have missed the most education, and begin to jumpstart that learning for them.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so when that happens and when you start to look at bringing kids back into the classroom, how will one teacher handle that?
So a lot of this, how will one teacher handle the differentiation?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, in many cases, it's not going to just be the one teacher, right? So the budget that we've built, the big push I made in this budget package was to make sure that we support at least the same level of staffing. A lot of communities had to lay off staff out of necessity. I wanted to find any possible solution that didn't do that, understanding that the human resources will be the most important investment of our budget, especially going forward post-COVID-19. So in cases where there's students on IEPs, they'll be supported by their classroom teacher, but also being supported by the special educator or the bilingual educator that's working with that child as well. In cases where classroom teachers are cut in some districts, those numbers grow exponentially, and that gets to be all the more complicated to try to meet the unique needs of children. So keeping class sizes to the extent that we can small, manageable, keeping staffing levels at what they were at least, and then making sure that our staff are targeting. It can be accomplished because it's going to be an all hands on deck approach.
Mm-hmm. There's been an idea floated that schools should just stall for a year for all students, and then everyone should pick up a year from now where they left off all at the same time with the same pause. What do you think of that kind of approach?
Well, I just wonder what's going to happen to the families who have to make ends meet and provide for their family. Like, you mean like stop, like kids not show up at school at all?
Yeah. I mean, there is talk about that. You hear a lot of different ideas being floated all around the country.
Well, I wonder how childcare falls into that, and who's going to, how does a family, how does a single parent with a 5-year-old pull that off if they can't go to work? I mean, I don't know. I don't see how that's going to be a helpful solution in the end, and it's going to be another year of regression.
So when you're thinking about education, you're also thinking about the families managing the child care. Is that what you're saying? That being able to let the parents go back to work by having their kids in school plays a big role in the decision to reopen?
That's absolutely right. I mean, in order for us to put the economy back on track, and not that I have to necessarily be worried about every part of the world, but that's part of the cycle. I think more than ever, parents have come to the realization that school plays a central role in how the day works and how they work. So when kids are back in school, parents can go back to work. They can provide for their family, and so we go. By having students at home, with 50% or less engagement, I don't see how that's going to do anybody any favors in the long term.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about reopening, because the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education provided justification for sending the kids back to school. They used some pretty scant data, quite frankly. One study was based on 18 kids in Australia, one from Ireland with 2 kids, and another from the French Alps. Are you comfortable with the actual science that they used to say that it's safe for the students to go back?
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard spot for me because I'm not a medical expert, and it's hard for me to second guess science. And so the state and superintendents around the country, around the world, actually, and I participated in a number of global forums, so that the data you referenced has been discussed. We're tracking that, but we're leaning on our medical professionals. If they're telling us that the latest guidance we're seeing is aspirational 6-foot distancing between students. But understanding that it could be as minimal as 3 feet between students. And they're coming at that conclusion based on pediatric research and science behind it. So we're having to rely on that. And while there's some level of risk, it seems to me, I don't know how else we can move forward. I mean, if you need a decision point, what data are you going to use? And it seems to me we have to use the medical research as the guiding the science.
Well, with that in mind, DESE has chosen to basically disregard the CDC recommendations of 6 feet and instead rely on a single WHO study that says that 3 feet is okay. Which one are you going with? And are principals or staff or custodians, are they literally going out to measure distances between desks and get things set up for that kind of a structure?
We are. So we're looking at that 3 to 6 foot range. So where we can accomplish a 6 foot distancing, and that's measured from the edge of one seat to the edge of the seat next to them in both directions. It's a 3 foot radius. And so where we can accomplish 6 feet of distance, we will. But we know we have that range of 3 feet. And that would require, obviously, every student we wear a face covering, including the teacher. In order to achieve that, though, because all of our schools have different configurations, classroom square footage is different. We're just meeting on that. We've been meeting on this, basically nonstop since March, is how we reopen. It's going to require us to basically take all of the furniture out of the rooms, which custodians do anyway. They clean the floors and then only put back student seating so that we can see about that spacing. We have some illustrations that show what 3 feet, what 6 feet look like. And so some cases we can accomplish 6 feet. In other cases we can't. In other cases, 3 feet's not even able to be accomplished, which means we have to put students in the hallway or find alternative spaces, libraries, cafeterias, stages, wherever we can find it. The goal, though, to be clear, the goal from the commissioner that we're hearing as superintendents is we should be planning for a 100% return to school. So that changed slightly because we were talking earlier about this being a hybrid model where we'd have to plan for sort of a 50% in, 50% out, and then swap those two populations, which would also be very complicated. But the guidance now is coming to us as a full return. So how can we make a full return work with 100% of our students coming in with those spacing requirements?
Right. For example, in many classrooms for younger children, they sit at tables. Multiple students sit at tables. Are you going to replace all those tables with desks for the young children?
Yeah, great question. We had that conversation just for about an hour this morning. I mean, teachers use bean bags. There's all kinds of, different kinds of sensory seating solutions that kids have. So it's not this idea of like a 1960s educational model where you have all these desks in rows and then you just take a desk out and you have, more space. Those aren't the configurations we use in the real world, at least not in classrooms that I've seen that are more project-based learning. So we're having to figure that out and say about, how can we create spaces? And so one solution, because I don't want us to rush as a district to spend more money either. And so I think that the go-to move, I think, for administrators who are only thinking about their building is, well, in order for me to pull off this distancing, I need, 200 desks. So let's order 200 desks. All right, there's a problem with that. One is that 200 desks come, if they even come on time. There could be a vaccination in place by the time the desks arrive, and then we've spent money on materials that we may or may not need. And so I'm trying to do kind of a sharing model where I have every school inventory, what they have in storage closets, what do they have for furniture. Even if it's older furniture that they have upgraded 5 years ago, it may be time to kind of dust off the other kind of furniture and see where it could be used across the district. And so that's what we're doing now is we're inventorying every school's available furniture, because you may find that there's desks at the high school that are not being used that could be then shifted to the elementary school that has typically been using more.
So you're taking a complete inventory and looking at everything you have in order to accommodate kids, not just desks, but whatever you have, and seeing
That's
how
it.
you can best use it. That makes sense. It's good to have that anyway. It's good to always go back to the basics and figure out what you have and how to best use it. So it's not necessarily being done because you're choosing, but it's definitely something worth having. What about wearing the face cloths and enforcing that? I mean, the CDC recommends that all people 2 years of age or older wear a cloth face covering in public settings, and when around people who don't live in the household, and especially, some of the social distancing measures are very difficult to maintain. How are the kids and the teachers going to be? Are they all going to be required to wear them? How are you going to enforce that?
Yeah. So, yeah, it's how do you enforce it now? It's one of those, sort of a
Yeah.
self-policing. It's being responsible to yourself and being responsible to those in your company.
It causes microaggressions, though. It really does.
It does, it can. And, maybe I have a designer mask and you don't have a designer mask. You have it's crazy. It's going to be a whole other level of
Are you going to
management.
provide them?
Yeah. So under the rule, schools will have to have the appropriate PPE, personal protective equipment, available. And that, when we did the estimate on that, based on the guidelines, and the guidelines right now, just to answer that question, require students from grade 2 up to have face coverings worn all day. We'll have to build in time for mask breaks. We have to figure that out too in the schedule. Students under the age of, under grade 2, so say preschool up to grade 2, that's not required, although recommended that they wear face coverings. The staff would have to wear face coverings. If on the school bus, though, all students would have to wear face coverings, regardless of what grade they're in. So those are some of the guidance that we're getting from the DESE, and it's coming.
Are you going
from,
to have somebody on the buses making sure that they're wearing them, because the drivers can't do that?
Yeah, I mean, as best you can with all of this, right? I mean, you're not going to be able to add staffing to police it. So what's the best way to manage it? It's going to have to be an understanding that we're all going to hold each other accountable. That's what we do now. And so it's not going to be perfect, and we're just going to do the best we can. So that's the restrictions on the face coverings that we're seeing. I'm concerned about the heat and what these coverings will mean, and obviously eating. But in order for us, given our size, based on the restrictions or the requirements for PPE, you're looking at over in excess of $2 million for that, just for the Framingham Public Schools. And where does that come from?
Well, and can you even get them?
Yeah, I think the procurement is less of a problem than the actual spending on it. And then what if you spend $2 million and there's a vaccine that comes out in November or December or whatever it comes out, and now you have $1 million worth of PPE that you don't need. So so we're trying to be thoughtful about getting at least securing enough for, say, the first third of the school year as a starting point to see how we do. But we have to make sure we can provide a mask for every child who doesn't bring one.
And all of this is because you're planning to come back to school. If you had remote learning, you wouldn't need all of that.
Yeah, except that goes back to the earlier point. It's back to the cycle. But remote learning, we know, doesn't work. I mean, it works for some.
Yeah. So let's talk about the plan. There's talk about the fact that you may want to bring students back to class up through grade 6, but you may offer remote learning for grades 7 through 12. Is that something is that your plan?
No, I'm not sure where that came from. That's an idea that was posited at one point by the department. Our directive in the plan is to return everybody 100%.
Now you say that these are guidelines. But they're not. You don't have to. They're guidelines. You get to make that ultimate decision, and you get to see what's right for Framingham and decide whether those guidelines are to be followed here in this district. But it sounds like you want to adopt the practices in accordance with those guidelines.
Yeah, yes and no. So what we're getting from information from the commissioner and the guidance on this is that, well, they are guidelines because districts do have different kinds of unique needs.
Right.
Anything that's recommended from the governor's advisory board, the health advisory board, is to be viewed as a mandate. So if, for example, they're saying you can only and we have yet to see the guidance on transportation. That's another one that's really weighing heavy on me, because even if we can accommodate 3 to 6 foot distancing in school, even if we can provide PPE for everybody, even if we can police that, how can we make sure that we can get 7,700 students on a bus? And that's
Well,
that's a major concern for me in the distancing that exists there. So we're waiting for that guidance. But we are adopting this. You're right; it is guidelines. But anything related to CDC or to best health practices is to be viewed as a mandate.
well, let's talk about the busing first. Durham Bus Company had some difficulty fulfilling their contractual obligations in the past just to get the kids to school on time. So what would you say to parents who are concerned that the transportation part of the reopening equation will not be a safe option? That maybe there's not a level of confidence and trust in their ability to keep kids safe and follow all the rules.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, by the time we had enough drivers and enough buses to get our kids to school, school closed. We had just finally gotten there. And so that was disappointing. We've been working with Durham and hopefully we'll have enough drivers to start the school year. If you had a 50% capacity, if we're running, say at $80,000 a school bus by the time you look at the cost of this thing, and if you had to double the number of buses and drivers in order to accommodate a 50% capacity, it would be unattainable. You just couldn't get there. There wouldn't be enough money, there wouldn't be enough drivers, and there wouldn't be enough buses. So we're going to have to get some really creative with some solutions, whether it's more runs of buses. And by the way, that creates a different problem. If you have more bus runs, then you have less time of students engaging with their teachers in school. And so you'd have to have a waiver from the department on the time on learning, because right now the structure gets everybody to school at a certain time and home at a certain time. Again, it's assuming the buses show up and the drivers are there.
Have you considered night classes for older kids?
Yeah, right now, everything's on the table. We're looking at that anyway at the high school to see about
Nights, weekends, yeah.
Yeah, and finding some alternative models. So we are exploring that. We've done some of that work already, but that is something that we're looking at. And also to see if there's an opportunity to start at the high school through this work as well. There might be. Again, I try to find the silver lining in all of these things, and maybe there's an opportunity to have a later start for our adolescents, which we know lines up with their circadian rhythms.
So what planning were you doing with Durham thus far? Has there been any progress or just in discussions?
Well, right now we're just trying to make sure that we are working with them to preserve the drivers and the buses to start school. But again, until we have the guidance from the state on that, and in a call yesterday, they've acknowledged, the state has acknowledged that this is their priority conversation, and we expect to have guidance in the next 2 weeks on that, and then that will then drive the conversation with Durham as to how we structure. But first, we're figuring out how we can make schools look, because the question we have to answer first is, can we make 100% student return happen in our schools with our current configurations? And so that's the pressure test.
Yeah, and that might be your intention, but have you even considered the fact that what if 30% of the parents decide not to send their kids back, that they don't have a level of confidence that this is safe, and they decide, no, we're not going to do that? How are they going to be accommodated? And how does that change the overall plan?
Yeah, and so it's a great point.
And it could be more than 30%, could be less.
It could be, and you know what? If 30% of families choose to keep their children home until there's a vaccine, it may help solve the problem, because then we'll have 30% less students in our schools and on our buses, and it may make everything work out just wonderfully. That creates other challenges, though. When a parent chooses to keep their child at home, then they say, okay, but today's the day they're going back. Well, we haven't accommodated that child. We haven't built out the system for that. And so we're looking at those kinds of questions, and also working with our teachers union to negotiate some conversation around how will video streaming work, because it seems to me that rather than a teacher recording a lesson, this is an opportunity to live stream a class. So students at home, they can actually watch in real time and engage in real time with their classroom teacher. But to do that requires impact bargaining with the teachers union, because this is clearly a change of working conditions. So there's another layer to all this that's sort of the back end that people don't necessarily see. That's an important part of the conversation.
And what kind of feeling are you getting from the discussions with the union thus far?
So thus far, we've had a good, working relationship with the FTA. You'll recall a little pushback in the start of the school year when it wasn't buses. It was conversations around lesson planning. You may recall those conversations of people being upset about these. And so we've been working through some of those challenges, and I think we've struck a good, amicable working relationship. So we engaged, literally, you mentioned back that first day in March 11th or so, we had the FTA at the table, Framingham Teachers Association representative, president, at the table with us. So we've been working, I would say, hand in hand with both the Framingham Teachers Association and the Framingham Administrators Association, and making sure that we're doing right by not only by our students and our staff, but also by the contracts that we've bargained in good faith. I expect that will continue going forward. They'll be engaged as partners in this work. I can't say the same for the MTA and the AFT at the state level. There's definitely positions that they've taken at those sort of higher state levels, but we're trying to at least locally work cooperatively.
Okay, well, let's talk for a minute about the teacher safety from K through 12. Now, you have young children who need help blowing their noses, tying their shoes, putting their coats on. You have older students who may just behave as if they're not at risk. Teachers are going to be on the front lines, many of them with their own autoimmune conditions and health concerns. How will you accommodate them?
Yeah, again, you have to go. It goes back to applying the health best practices. Lots of hand washing. There's going to be some of that we're going to have to just do. I mean, a lot of what happens, especially in early childhood, as you mentioned, is hands-on. What happens with kids who require physical mobility kinds of special education services that require that close contact? So there's provisions for that. There's safety guidelines for those sort of close contact situations that, again, it goes back to the hand washing. It goes back to all the preventative measures that we can take.
Right, but really it's a much more serious issue for the teachers. You said earlier in our discussion that the kids are at a very low risk, but you have a lot of older teachers or teachers who have conditions and are on medication or have had compromised immune systems, and they're going to be asked to come back to the classroom. The kids may carry this COVID-19. They may not show symptoms. How are you going to accommodate their concerns and keep them healthy if hand washing isn't the only answer?
Yeah, I don't have all the answers to all the questions, I'm afraid, but we'll certainly look at that. There's exemptions. In addition to just teachers who may be vulnerable, based on their age or if they're immunocompromised. They may have childcare issues that they can't accommodate because they may live in a different school district that's doing something totally different. And what if they have a childcare need and they can't actually come to school and teach because they have a young child? They too are also parents and family members. And so there's going to be provisions for that. And so there are exemptions that happen under the law. But you're right, that's going to have to be something we have to look at. It's going to come up.
So
it's going to be raised.
Yeah, there was some kind of a presentation made to department heads or teachers. I want to share one of the slides that was shown there and ask for your opinion about this. So
Yes.
This is something that teachers are being asked to sign off on.
That's
and
correct.
Now,
Yep.
they're in a different situation than the students, and obviously, that's a concern to many. So, yeah, and they're an important part of the equation. I mean, you can bring all the students back, but without the teachers, it doesn't matter. So, having a level of comfort for them and then having them sign something like this is something I wanted to ask you about as to, what's being done to protect them. The other thing that I think they were told was that the ADA exemptions would be upheld if you have a condition as defined by the American with Disabilities Act, that would be honored.
That's
but
right.
That doesn't cover people who have compromised immune systems.
It could, if they have a doctor's note. Again, it would require some. It can't just be, the mindset can't be, well, I'm just not comfortable coming back, and if there's a medical reason not to, that's a different conversation for sure. But again, it's imperfect. What I'd like to be able to do is, a vaccine can't come soon enough, of course, but it may be an opportunity because we're going to be surveying our educators as well. So we want to be sensitive as an employer. If we find that we have, say, X number of students that are able to be or going to be at home because their families choose to keep them at home, and you have, Y number of staff that are in the same situation where they're not comfortable, even if they don't have a medical exemption, is there an opportunity to create a pathway for the teachers to be matched up with the students relative to their disciplines and age, to actually have this sort of world within a world of a virtual learning environment? And so that we're looking at that as a viable solution as well. So we can try to meet everybody's needs, the students and the staff members' needs both.
Right. I understand that, and I know that you have a lot of decisions to make, but let's just take an example. You have, say, maybe someone who, had an organ transplant and is on a lot of medication and who teaches kindergarten.
Mm-hmm.
What does that person do?
So that person would probably be, because they're compromised in their immune system, so the organ isn't rejected, I'm sure they're much more vulnerable, in which case it seems to me they would probably have exemptions under the law because of medical exemptions. So in that case, that teacher we would try to work out a situation where they would work from home in a remote environment, and perhaps they're doing something in this virtual learning academy that we envision.
So you're
So
not
Bill,
going to, people aren't going to lose their jobs if they have an autoimmune condition and they can't necessarily be in a classroom environment.
no.
Okay.
The idea is to match up the interest. It's also like students. If a family chooses to keep their child home because they're not comfortable with the distancing or the fact that there's not a vaccination or anything, we're not going to hold that family accountable either to saying, well, we're not going to bring them to court because you're failing to bring your child to school, which might have been the case pre-COVID. It might have been just viewed as irresponsible parenting. That's altogether different right now. It's a time to try to make the situation work as best as we can and to meet all needs. And that's a much bigger challenge in Framingham than it is in other communities.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's a big challenge overall for sure. Let's talk a little bit about the academics and what will happen in terms of dropout rates, the lack of student engagement, the achievement gap. What are some of the steps that you're taking right now to better address some of these issues? There are issues that you've wanted to address for a long time, but now you have to look at them closer and differently.
Yeah, so we've been trying to get a sense of the inequities. Technology being just one glaring example of that. And so one of the first orders of business when students do return is to ensure that they have access to a device, they have access to reliable internet connection at home. Some of that we've been able to figure out from a distance, but it's been very challenging to do that when we're trying to make reaches to families. We've also been making an effort to reach out to every single family. That was easier to do when we were in school, and teachers, we had the full roster of our staff to make those overtures to families. And so we've been doing that to track their level of engagement. But we're going to have to go back. It goes back to the standards that we've identified. And this is the silver lining here. We've been working for years of trying to get to a point where we have an established norm of expectations. So grade 3, this is what we expect across the district, not some schools achieving here and here and here. And so we've been able to rally the teachers together and have meetings about that so we know precisely where they ought to be. We have to come into the start of the school year thinking that we're not starting with the curriculum in September in grade 4. We're starting with the curriculum in March of grade 3. And having to build that up forward. And so there's going to be those inequities that we have been uncovered through remote engagement. I'm concerned about students who have engaged at all since March. And there's going to be a lot of catch-up work to be done. And that doesn't happen without the staffing, which is why it goes back to the budget. The budget included the staffing to preserve, because it's going to be case by case. It's going to be the first time we've customized learning for every single kid.
Mm-hmm. Now, you've talked about a standard, but yet some departments are working on curriculum differently than others. Some are ordering books, some are preparing to return to the old paradigm, while others are asking for funding to purchase online platforms to enhance remote learning. Are you going to try to create a greater level of consistency, or are departments able to work independently and make those decisions for themselves? How does that work?
Yeah, so we're still cleaning up from some years past, as I think I mentioned on a previous program with you, is where schools were, and I don't mean to paint a picture of any of my predecessors, but however it happened, where some schools were granted more resources than other schools were. And that's how we started building our budget around the equity model. And so some of that is happening is we're trying to provide more resources. Like, for example, we spent an awful lot of money at King Elementary School to make the library more robust because it had a fraction of any other elementary school's library. So some of that spending is disproportionate, but it's done intentionally to make sure that we get to an even playing field. And then once we get to the even playing field, once we get to a sort of an equality level, now it's the equity adjustment, because now we know that we have certain schools where the demand for text in multiple languages is the need. And so now we're spending money in that direction to make sure we can adjust for differentiate for the need in each of our schools. So that's the work that's been happening. We have to be careful of sort of the one-offs of teachers who are signing up with a third-party remote learning solution, because unless that's been vetted and has the privacy rights that have to be vetted, we shut those down, because there's a checks and balances on that to make sure that our student information isn't vulnerable to breaching. And
well,
so,
if you talk to different teachers, or you hear different stories about what they're doing, so I think that in terms of bringing more consistency, that may be something that warrants some guidelines internally. because it does seem that there are different approaches. And I know that you've been addressing that for a while, but in this era, it seems like everyone has to be on board.
Yeah, without a doubt. And again, we've had a lot more, this virtual environment, we've had more meetings than ever. And I think that's been helpful in some ways that we're getting to a tighter alignment. But every curriculum has a cycle of review, and we're looking at that as well as to what kind of texts are we using that support that. Do we have the right text? Do we have texts that reflect the students in our classes, or are they largely biased one way or another? And so that's part of this ongoing review as well that we have. So there's a lot of work in the curriculum side of the house.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Now, how are you addressing the needs of ELL or SPED students during this whole cycle of remote learning and going forward?
I would say every school district, including Framingham, is not doing enough to support those two populations in particular that you've named. Mm-hmm. It's just, and for any number of reasons, we've tried to make efforts. So, for example, we provide a learning calendar, or when school was in session, we provided a learning calendar in multiple languages. This summer, for example, we know we've identified a list because we know all of our teachers and our support staff are not working. It's summer vacation, but our 12-month employees are working. So we've identified a lengthy list of nearly 400 students that we're watching, that we're concerned about, and then we're taking that list and dividing it among our 12-month employees, and then identifying who speaks what language among our 12-month staff, so they can make a personal reach to families to check in on them, to make sure we're checking on food security, making sure they're checking in on what other resources they may have, mental health needs, and then to put them in touch with the right resources. So that's a whole different level of what I would say is a two-way family engagement that we've never seen in public education. And we're working hard to stay connected with our families. But in terms of fulfilling IEPs, even while the law or the current rules of engagement might forgive the fact that you're not providing the full scope of an IEP, there's still the need of an IEP that's not being met. So on the one hand, we're saying, yeah, well, we don't have to do that because we can't do that. But the reality is that the child needs those support services. And so how are we going to mitigate that? And
what if you have children, right? And what if you have children who travel out of town, out of the city for out of district placement, and where they go is not going to be open?
Yeah, so I haven't seen the guidance on that specific question, but that's a great question. I don't know. I apologize for even saying I don't know, but there's going to be matters here that I just don't have all the answers for, but that's a great question.
Another question I have for you having to do with English language learners and even enrollment. There have been some bans on travel back and forth between Brazil and the United States. We have a large Brazilian population in Framingham. What are you seeing in terms of enrollment changes?
So the enrollment still, we're expecting our enrollment based on the numbers of registrations, not the actual walk-ins when we see them when school year begins, and that will be an interesting number to see. But our enrollment's expected to increase about a little over 200 students this year. That's across the district.
Based on what?
Just more students coming to Framingham.
Having registered already, you mean?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, based on registrations for next year. So part of the driver of the budget was an additional 220 students factored in.
Do you know, now is that with the expectation that all the other students who are currently enrolled are coming back? Because have they even been polled to see if they are coming back?
So, well, no. I mean, the expectation is that students who are in their seats, unless they've withdrawn, the expectation is that they are coming back because compulsory school attendance is 6 to 16, as you know. So the expectation is they are in school, whether it's Framingham or someplace else, or unless they're in a homeschool situation. So again, COVID-19 does change the game on that. There could be families that choose to keep their children home or move or whatever they choose to do. But based on the registrations, in the springtime, we're expecting 220 more students than we had last school year. That said, I don't know who actually will show up on day one because the world is different.
Right. A lot of high school students took jobs when school stopped having in-classroom participation and learning. A lot of students, there were students who had to go to work to help their families, who've gotten a taste of the real world and jobs and having a paycheck. It would be very interesting to see if you reached out to the high school students, especially whether or not they have intentions of returning.
Yeah, we will be doing that. We did a baseline, survey, mostly to families, but certainly checking in with students would be an interesting, another interesting data point. to consider. And, and then you raise another interesting point too about quarantining. And this is an answer that I'm waiting to get as well. Because if families are traveling, let's say a new student's coming to us, and I'll just pick a state, coming to us from Vermont,
Right.
and the students coming in, there's going to be right now there's a 14-day self-quarantine adjustment period that family would have to self-police. But what happens if a teacher is on vacation in Maine in August? How does that work? Does the teacher have to quarantine also for 14 days and then not come to school? And so I've raised that question with the department. I haven't got an answer on that yet, but it's an important question. And I imagine it's even more important to communities where they have a lot more students who are traveling and staff that are traveling, depending on their means.
Yes.
That could be very problematic. People are all around the world, assuming the borders open.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about some of the other components of education, like athletics and the arts, physical education. What's happening with all of those services?
God, as you ask all these questions, I think to myself, this is a terrible time to be a superintendent, right? I mean, this is...
Well, you know what it is? It's really, if you think about it, it's really what zero-based budgeting is about. It's about going back and recreating from the beginning. And you're being asked right now to do that, and that's a tough thing to do while you're in process. But
yeah, well, without a doubt, and that's a great question right now. So we'll try to take those apart a little bit individually. So athletics is governed, as you know, but maybe for viewers who may not know, is governed by the Massachusetts Interscholastic Athletic Association, MIAA. And MIAA has their own separate task force that's looking at sports. There are certain sports that you could have bring back pretty easily. Golf, as an example, could happen fairly easily because the social distancing's naturally in there. Wrestling, on the other hand, that presents a different kind of challenge because of the proximity. So what sports can you bring back? You have to be mindful too that, you're looking at student athletes coming back. This for many of them defines their academic, their career, their school careers in large part, driven by their extracurricular, by what they do in athletics and what they do in the arts.
right. So what are you going to offer? Are you going to have some sporting? Is there going to be football? Is there going to be lacrosse? Is there going to be hockey? Are all those sports under evaluation right now?
They all are, and we've asked our coaches to come up with some alternative plans for how you can do even preseason. That's even come up with football, and so our coaches are coming up with solutions that can engage kids in safe ways. And so we're taking all those proposals and we're vetting them through Dr. Wong, through the Department of Public Health, to make sure that they're viable solutions, and keeping our coaches and our kids connected. That's the name of the game. Band and chorus in particular are two areas that are kind of unknown right now because it's concern about the droplets that are ejected through one singing or through playing a musical instrument that requires the use of spit. You have spit valves on brass instruments, for example, but yet that wouldn't apply to string instruments. So I've not seen guidance yet on how band rehearsals or choral rehearsals can happen, but yet they're truly integral parts to our curriculum. So in one day, this will be past us, and we don't want to, what a lot of school districts have done, and I say a lot, I don't know if it's a lot, but what some have done, and it's very discouraging and disheartening, is to view that as sort of low-hanging fruit, if you will, and to say, well, one way to save money is let's just cut arts programming since we can't have band or chorus anyway. And what ends up happening there is you take away opportunities for kids, and then when the vaccine is in place, then what do? You can't restore it mid-year. In many cases, oftentimes those educators have found jobs in other communities. And so it's really important to preserve as much as we can to make sure we provide our opportunities for kids, particularly in these extracurriculars, because for many of our students, that's the driver for them to come to school every day. They're not coming to school every day for math. I mean, some of them are. Let's
talk a little bit about the budget and the finances. What will you do if Chapter 70 funding for fiscal 21 does not come in as expected?
The staff are going to be the most important element to making this right.
Which staff?
All staff, because you have at every level, you have support staff that are providing support services to students. You have classroom teachers that are reinventing education. You have administrators, principals, and vice principals who are figuring this work out literally every day, trying to reinvent. You have central office administrators that are working this problem literally day and night to come up with an answer to invent education on the fly. So everybody is working literally harder than ever right now to make this work. So to take away the human resources piece of this would be hugely problematic, because if a district were to come back, let's say a district that laid off 100 of their employees, and this has happened in some surrounding communities, as I'm sure you know, that changes the ability for your class size. So if now you have less educators and you have higher class size numbers, you may not have the configuration of a room to bring back students at a 3 or 6 foot distance. So now what? And so this is sort of the cycle of challenges. And so it seems to me that the best you can do is preserve the number of adults you have to dissipate the students so you can make it work. And so that's where we're at. So if Chapter 70 comes in lower than expected, then we have to go back and say, where can we make reductions that don't affect the class?
Would you potentially be looking at cuts to your administrative staff? That staff has grown with all the assistant vice principals, assistant superintendents, et cetera. You also have COLAs in the budget, cost of living adjustments for fiscal 21. Would those be some of the things you would be looking at first, or do you have a priority list?
No, I think that's important. We've already made, since I came on board in 2017, I've made about $400,000 in shifts. That's to the positive, not added to the budget, of central office administrators. There were a lot of central office administrators, for example, that did a lot of things that it wasn't clear to me in the org systems. And so I made a lot of shifts in that direction. I did add assistant superintendents in some ways to have oversight, but it didn't come at the net bottom line, came actually at a lower number than what was in place in every previous budget. That said, this fiscal 21 budget already reduces 2 additional central office administrators from what was previously budgeted.
Right, those were the vacant positions that are just not being filled right now.
Oh, well, that's true, but bear in mind that those are vacant because those administrators are on assignment, both serving as principals. So right. That's true, but those positions are real. They're needed because the one area we don't want to skimp on is teaching and learning. It's the most important. It's like a company cutting their research and development budget. You just don't do it. And so there's other areas we could look at, but is there spending that we can reduce in other ways? We'll have to look at that. Everything's on the table. If the Chapter 70 comes in lower, and unless the school committee, but bear in mind that this is the school committee's budget also, so I can't speak for what their interest will be, but it seems to me that everybody's committed to going back to the table and finding out how to save some money.
Right. According to the numbers that DESE puts out in comparing Framingham to the DART group, which is the districts that are considered to be most like Framingham, the administrative costs for Framingham are over 70% higher than the comparative DART group.
Yeah, I really don't have that to speak to. I don't have that prepared for this conversation, okay. But I'm happy to pull that up. And
yeah, it's just something that I think when you're talking about putting resources in the classroom, the question then comes up, where does that money come from, and does it have to come from somewhere else in the budget? And of course, the question then becomes, where are the top heavy expenses? You have administrators that are, very highly paid, car allowances, all kinds of extra stipends, et cetera, in their compensation packages. Would those be things that you would be taking a look at in order to put more money back in the classroom?
Well, there's a balance there. You think about some of the administrators. Some of that's governed under, like you mentioned, the FAA, Framingham Administrators Association. So there is those who do belong. There's employees that belong to a bargaining unit, and there's non-union employees that are also administrators. I also think it's important to honor contracts where contracts are given. So that's an important point. I worry too much too about thinking that that just because it's top heavy, you should just slice up all the sort of top level administrators because the most important work is happening in the classroom. But I'll tell you, that's true. But who's designing what's happening in the classroom right now is the administrators. So I wonder who that falls to. Because if you take away all your levels of support that have to design schools and you cut them, then who's designing the return plan? And I'm not sure who would do that. We're engaging teachers, but that work, to be sure, is being led by these highly paid administrators that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Do you believe? Let's talk a little bit about the surplus at the end of the fiscal 20 year, which just ended. There's a $4 million surplus in the school budget. Do you believe that should be given back to the city taxpayers and put back in the city budget?
I think there should be a conversation that happens so that, we came forward with the school budget knowing there would be some surplus. That surplus obviously increased because of us not being in school, not consuming the kinds of utility usage and kinds of consumable materials. So that does fall to the bottom line. So I think there should be a really thoughtful look, and that has happened. I know that Lincoln Lynch has worked closely with Mary Ellen Kelly in finding out what can be carried, but I think there's got to be a balance. I think there's got to be a way to make sure we can make ends meet in the school department without balancing it on the backs of personnel cuts. And at the same time, if there is extra, then we should give that back to the city. Because there's other needs that are comparable in other departments. So I think it's about just being cooperative. So I fully support that move.
So let's talk a little bit about, you have cost of living adjustments for, in addition to steps and lanes in the fiscal 21 budget, and yet the unemployment rate is so high and other municipal employees have salary freezes for, with no cost of living adjustments in the fiscal year. Is that an area of opportunity there? And why do you feel that that's validated at this point in time?
Yeah.
Or-
So again, well, I think
Yeah.
it's not my place to say whether it's validated or not. It was bargained in good faith, and so cost of living is a function whether or not there's actually unless it's tied specifically to cost of living index in the community or in the country. Otherwise, it's factored in. It's built in addition to steps and lanes, as you mentioned. So that would require impact bargaining, require bringing back the unions to the table and saying, is there a need? But again, that goes back to the question: is there a need? And I think
Right.
that goes back to what's the Chapter 70 configuration?
Well,
And
yeah,
so
is
that
there a
may
need?
be.
And is
I don't
it
know.
equitable? And if chapter, exactly, yeah, lots of things. Would you go back to the table on that?
I think if Chapter 70 numbers come in low, there's going to have to be a conversation about how you find the difference. And I think at that point, do you engage with unions to say, can we do a salary freeze? Can we forego cost of living adjustments, whatever it may be? I think everything's on the table. But again, let's wait and see. We don't expect that we'll see the legislature's budget until what, July 15th or something.
Hmm. Right. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the SROs, the school resource officers. I'd like to talk about diversity and some of the issues right now that have to do with policing in the schools. How many SROs, special school resource officers, do you have currently?
So there are currently 2 school resource officers that are provided by the Framingham Police Department.
And that's the total number you have for the entire district?
For the Framingham Public Schools, I know that Keith Tech also has one. I don't know if
Okay.
it's a dedicated officer or not.
So there have been complaints about SROs, and there's a growing movement now to reevaluate the need. And what are your thoughts and discussions that you're having about that right now?
Yeah, it's interesting. I get emails on sort of both sides of that daily. There's petitions on both sides of eliminate SROs, keep SROs. Of course, this comes upon the murder of George Floyd and what's happening with just generally defunding of policing movement across the country. And so we're sensitive to that. Obviously, we had engaged the conversation with a number of, actually, I think it was 2 weeks ago today. We had a Zoom meeting with representative groups from FREE, the Framingham Families for Racial Equity and Education, also students from the Black Student Union, other voices from the high school, secondary level administrators, principals, vice principals, the mayor, myself, police chief, Joseph Corzini from our Office of Equity, Diversity, and Community Development. And so we engaged a conversation, more of a listening conversation about our students and some of the way our students feel about having police presence in school. And it was an important conversation. It was important for us to hear. And it's not happening just in Framingham, as you know, it's happening elsewhere
Right.
too.
There's a petition to keep them. There's a petition to eliminate
Yeah,
them.
there's both. So where do you find the balance? So, we had our first sort of listening tour, if you will, on the conversation. I know that the mayor, other way, I was in another meeting, wasn't able to watch yesterday. I understand that it came up yesterday as well in her community conversation. And so there'll be a follow-up meeting that I'll have with the chief and with the mayor about sort of next steps from there. We want to engage our partners. We want to engage FREE, Black Student Union, others, particularly students who are made to feel, or who are fearful. There's really no sense in having, if there's a police officer in our schools and our students are fearful of the police officer, that is not the environment we want to create. We want to create an environment where our students feel safe. And so we have to get to the root cause of what's causing that problem. Is it the positioning of the SRO? Is it their involvement in discipline, which it shouldn't be? They shouldn't be involved in discipline. We're looking at arrest data. We're looking at other kinds of data that will emerge through our equity audit around disproportional discipline of students of color in particular. And so we have all this sort of in the mix, and we want to work cooperatively with our community partners to make a decision as to how to proceed with that. So some of it may be not having officers stationary, but having officers available. Maybe downplaying the dress, less formal, maybe more casual, as some districts do. So it's a conversation that I have to have with the police and with the mayor.
Right. So let's talk a little bit also about what you're doing on diversity, because most of the students that do feel uncomfortable with the SROs are Black and brown students who feel that they are being profiled. And I'm curious, number one, about rates of suspension and disciplinary action for students of color versus white students. Do you keep records on that?
Yeah, we do. So we're looking at that data now. Again, we enlisted the support to do a full-on audit. And so the results of that audit, I think, are due out the end of this month. So we'll have more data on that specifically.
Good.
But that's the data we want to look at and point to for how we're, how are we managing our operation. We're also simultaneously looking at developing, right now we're in the throes of a code of character, conduct, and support model. And that's more of a restorative model, so that we're not leaning on school suspensions or in-school suspensions or expulsions, which are very few, if any.
Right.
And kind of moving away to being more restorative. And so we engage teams of educators and administrators and community members to be part of those conversations.
Okay, so that
But
report
they're
is coming out at the end of this month?
That's right, yep.
Okay. How is HR going to start working on getting a more diverse staff, that more people of color? You recently discontinued a visa program for teachers from Spain. So how, and Latino teachers, maybe from places like New York, Miami, and Puerto Rico, could better reflect the cultural differences in our schools. So what are the plans for when HR will begin building principles and be accountable for making a more diverse workforce in the Framingham Public Schools?
So just to be clear about your first point, we didn't eliminate the teachers coming from Spain. That was done under the current directive from the President of the United States, that we can't. There's no J1 visas being offered. So we have teachers who are still operating under J1. Yeah, just to be clear, because we in fact just brokered a relationship with Brazil to try to get teachers. Because we think about the educators that reflect our demographic. We're largely Brazilian, Portuguese speaking population of students, and we have not a lot of teachers from Brazil, not a lot of native speakers of Portuguese in our teaching ranks. So that's as important as it is to diversifying the color of our staff, which we're also trying to do. And so part of the struggles we face is with retaining staff of color. In particular, is Framingham is a desirable place to live. It's not like the most desirable. It's not as fun as Boston to live in, and Boston pays better. There's more opportunities. Framingham is a pretty decent, social experience for some. So Joseph Corzini has been meeting with. He's created some affinity groups. I think just the last couple of days he's been meeting with the 3 or 4 that exist, and he has some information that he wants to share back with me about what are our teachers of color thinking. What do they need to be feeling more supported in their work? And are they in meetings where there's people around the table who look like them, so they're not feeling like they're the one-off here or there? Right. So we're really being intentional about that. And again, I think, sadly with COVID-19, there may be opportunities for us to recruit and actually bring over to our team administrators of color. We have 2 principalships that will be opening up that we'll be doing searches for. We have right now Brenda Morrow, who's, as you mentioned, one of the directors that we didn't fill. Right. And right now she's covering at Stapleton. And we have, what's the other school I'm thinking of? We just, Barberry. Right. Barberry is the other school. Right now we have Maria Davis. Who's,
right, but you need that spread out throughout the entire district to have a more diverse administration.
But it takes you to start somewhere. So you start with where you have vacancies, and and hopefully we can make it attractive enough where candidates of color will want to apply, and then being more intentional about getting to historically Black colleges to actually recruit. There's ways that we can be much more intentional about that, and that's work that our HR department is working on. But again, it comes down in some cases to salary. Boston does pay more, and in many of our candidates we lose to Boston.
I have about 30 seconds left. So just in closing, I want to ask, with you as one of the top administrators in the community and the mayor as the other, what is the working relationship that the 2 of you have? And would she agree with your assessment? Yeah,
I think we are working hard to, I don't know. I don't know what the mayor would say, but I'd like to say that we're working cooperatively. I mean, sometimes we find that with school budgets, for example, that can be a challenge where she's trying to look at the big picture of the whole city, and my focus is on looking at sort of my part of the world. So the budget can be an area of challenge. But generally speaking, I've participated in a number of forum events or community conversations, and I think our working relationship is a good one.
Well, I want to thank you so much for taking this time today. We covered a lot of topics.
We did.
We probably could have covered each one separately for the same amount of time. So let's check back in again in the near future and see how things are going. And good luck with all the challenges ahead. And thank you so much, Dr. Tremblay, for your time.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
You too. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.